Hello everyone and welcome to CRF's webinar on evidence-based HR. So I'm Gillian Pillins for those of you who don't know me, and I'm joined today by Professor Rob Briner, who is one of the authors of our recently published research, Strong Foundations, looking at evidence-based HR. So our agenda today, we're going to be looking to answer 4 questions really. One is, what is evidence-based HR? Why should we care about it? How can we do it better? And what's stopping us from doing it better? So we'll be exploring those 4 questions, and we'll be talking through the findings of our recent research. For those of you not familiar with this, you hopefully be aware this is round 1 of 2 that we're doing on evidence-based HR. So the purpose of this report is really to take stock on what's happened since previous research we did in 2011, and we'll be setting up for stage 2, which is really going into developing some really practical methodologies, models and frameworks that you can use to enhance evidence-based HR practice in your organisation. Now, for those of you who have joined CRF webinars before, you know that we love as much interaction as we can. So please do ask lots of questions. We'll be pausing throughout to give you an opportunity to put your questions to Rob, and we'll also be doing some polls because we love to get your input to help us shape the discussion as well. So Rob, let's sort of kick things off by exploring what is evidence-based HR? I mean, I think it's one of those things that surely we all in some way or another are using evidence in HR practice, but how is evidence-based HR any different to what practitioners typically do?
That's a sort of question that I think people often ask because they're aware they always use evidence. So there are also some very important differences, and as you said, all practitioners always use evidence, but I think they don't usually do 3 other things, which is to use multiple sources of evidence, to adopt an explicit and structured approach, and to focus on the most trustworthy kinds of evidence. In other words, yes, we always use evidence, but the use of evidence in decision making is, if you like, suboptimal. So it could be done much better. So evidence-based practice in general evolved to help practitioners make better informed decisions in 2 ways. Firstly, about what are the problems and opportunities faced by those they serve, as practitioners, who are they actually sort of serving, and also choosing intervention should they find problems, opportunities that are most likely to help. And I think a lot of people have heard of evidence-based something, and quite often people maybe heard of evidence-based medicine, but actually these are some of the fields which have explicitly tried to adopt evidence-based practice, from architecture to education to medicine, philanthropy, social work, urban planning, and every single field is the same deal, where practitioners were trying to look at what's going on and what we can do about it, and evidence-based practice is a framework for helping us do that. So that's really the difference.
Right, okay. And
one example of this is, and again, we're going to have a poll in a second. This is an example, I think, that illustrates some of the principles. That you arrive in a large European city, you don't know, it's 6 o'clock on the evening, you really like food and drink, and eating in restaurants, and your host is inviting you to choose where you want to eat. You can eat anywhere you want, but it's a place you would really like to eat. So the question is, how would you decide which restaurant to book? Would you actually seek evidence and information? So perhaps if people want to put in the chat now, if you're in this situation, where would you look for evidence or information about where you might want to eat? Anybody got any ideas? Where would you look? Ask the local, says somebody. Google Maps, fantastic, yeah. TripAdvisor.
TripAdvisor.
Well, TripAdvisor is an interesting. So TripAdvisor is one of those things that, in my view, it's not very reliable. But of course, people have different opinions about whether it's reliable or not. But certainly, you would look at evidence. You look at multiple sources, and the key thing is, would you also consider the trustworthiness of that evidence? And of course, it's important you do that. So TripAdvisor might not be too good. Maybe the locals would be good. And would you take a structured approach? Probably, if it was a really important decision, if you're really interested in food. So now we'll go to a poll. You've identified some sources. And to think about getting a better dinner, And the poll here is going to ask you a few questions about whether, first, are you more or less likely to get a good meal if you use some evidence versus no evidence? So I'll give you a few minutes to think about it. If you use some evidence, are you more or less likely to get a good meal? Okay, the second one, if you use multiple sources, are you more or less likely to get a good meal versus one source? The third question there is, which I can't see, can I?
So you use the information with awareness of its trustworthiness.
Oh yeah, okay.
Versus without awareness. Yeah. And then question 4, you use a structured or systematic approach.
Yeah.
Versus an unstructured or random approach.
Thank you very much, yeah. So some results are coming in now. So yeah, you can see that, so given your responses to this, you all understand the principles of evidence-based practice. So that is basically, they are the principles that you are more likely to get a good dinner if you use evidence, if you use multiple sources, if you're aware of how trustworthy it is, and also if you take a structured approach. So they are, in essence, the main principles. So when we're going to talk about evidence-based practice, evidence-based HR this afternoon, if you just bear in mind this example, because this really demonstrates the main principles, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So this is something that we've certainly, as CRF, been looking at for over a decade. Yeah. And I think one of the conclusions of our research is that evidence-based HR is becoming more widespread and more prominent, but perhaps slower than we might like.
Yes.
Can you just fill us in a little bit on,
sure.
on the history of EBHR and where it's come from? So
this is roughly going back some time now to think about when it first started being discussed. If you go back right back to 2000, as it happens, I wrote a chapter in a book, which I think is the first ever example of anyone writing about this. But importantly, in August 2011, you can see on the bottom there, that's when CRF produced its first report with myself and Wendy Hirsch into evidence-based HR. And there's been some other moves. KPMG produced a report, some other people produced reports up to 2011, and then more recently, you can also see articles, for example, in HR magazine in the UK, People and Strategy, SHRM in the United States, CIPD in the UK started trying to adopt evidence-based HR as one of its kind of core principles. There's even a doctorate launched at Birkbeck University of London, evidence-based HR. And now we've gone to now, which is where we have released our second report into evidence-based HR. So it's been around for a while. It's clear the sort of increasing momentum, how widespread it is. We're not too sure, but that's partly what the next report's going to be around as well. But there's definitely, I guess you could say, movement, more interest in it, more publications, more activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the objectives behind this whole research project is to produce some really practical tools, frameworks, models,
absolutely,
that practitioners can pick up and use to evolve their practice. Where are we at so far in terms of having formal models or frameworks for EBHR?
So there are some formal models, and actually a lot of these come from these definitions I mentioned before. There's lots of different areas of professional practice that do it. And in fact, the definitions they have are very, very similar. Even though they're working in completely different fields, the way they define it is quite similar. So we define it as a process which delivers better informed and hence more accurate answers to two fundamental questions. First, which are the most important problems or opportunities facing the organisation, which are relevant to HR activities? So what's going on, what's important? Second, which kinds of solutions or interventions are most likely to help? In other words, what's going on and what can we do about it? And those questions are answered through a combination of the best available evidence, but also using critical thinking. And this is a model which can help people organise, I guess, around it. This kind of process of number one is designing and answering answerable questions. Secondly, collecting evidence of different kinds to answer them. Thirdly, pulling it together in some way, then using that evidence, applying it to assess and then assessing the process and outcome. So it's a kind of cyclical process by which you ask a question and praise it. And what's interesting, I think for me anyway, is if you think about the choosing a restaurant example I just gave, it's exactly the same process. You will go through the process in exactly the same way to ask various questions about how am I going to get a better dinner. It's the same process. So one of the other things is that people may have already started thinking about is what are those multiple sources of evidence? Now, in every area of HR, every area of evidence-based practice, there are different sources of evidence, there's multiple sources, but for us, typically, there's kind of 4 sources. And I'm going to give you an example now, and we'll talk about some more examples in a minute, but the example of high turnover. So if you felt there was an issue with high turnover in an organisation, what kind of evidence from what sources would you gather to try and answer those questions? I'm just going to give you examples of the kinds of questions you would ask. I'm not going to give you answers, but these are the kinds of questions. So the first area is stakeholders' views and perspective. What do senior managers think is going on with turnover? Do line managers see a problem with turnover? What is the problem here from a stakeholder perspective? In each case, we always ask how trustworthy and relevant is that evidence? So it's a key point. Not all evidence is trustworthy, not all evidence is relevant, so we should always ask that for any source. The next source, we might use evidence from inside the organisation. This will be classic people analytics sort of data, where we'd say, where's turnover happening? What are the trends over time? Can we relate turnover rates to any other organisational data, any other data we've got? Can we make sense of it that way? The third area is professional expertise. What do we as HR professionals from our experience think is going on? What do we think, do we have the expertise now to do it? Drawing on our experience, what do we think of the likely causes of high turnover? And finally, scientific evidence. If we look at the scientific evidence, what's out there in terms of understanding what are the causes of turnover and why that might be a problem. So this is the first stage. This is saying what's going on. And one quite a striking thing, I think, when people are trying to do evidence-based practice in general, is they tend to jump pretty quickly to a solution without really spending time on this. But this is obviously crucial because as HR professionals, we should be focusing on important issues and problems for the business. And without going through this program, this process is a tendency to just pick on stuff and do it rather than think, is this actually relevant to the organisation? So this is the first bit, asking questions about what the problem is. And it's exactly the same process if you discover an issue with high turnover, what you can actually do about it. So again, stakeholders to senior managers or have ideas or theories about how to tackle the issue, what employees might think might help, going over to evidence from the organisation, can predictors of turnover be identified? Are they amenable to change? And maybe there's already interventions taking place to try and help with turnover. Are they working? They're not working. Also, the professional expertise of practitioners, again, is crucial. What do you think as a practitioner in terms of what you can do about it? And also scientific evidence. Is the scientific evidence around that says, well, these are quite good interventions to help turnover? And again, as with every area, is it relevant and trustworthy? Can you actually use it?
And this is really important in terms of debunking one of the myths around evidence-based HR. You've pointed out that there are multiple sources of evidence, but they're not always scientific evidence.
Absolutely not. No.
And they're not always quantitative evidence.
Yes.
So the views of experienced and influential people can have great weight and are still compatible with an evidence-based approach.
That's a really important point, because often when people hear the word evidence, they think of purely quantitative sort of scientific type evidence, and that is only it's a part of it, but it's only one part of it. And other kinds of data and other kinds of evidence from the sources are equally important. I mean, for example, it may be that when you talk to stakeholders, that proves to be one of the most important sources of evidence or data you're using to help you decide what to do. Whereas people analytics might not be so relevant for a particular problem. So it's absolutely essential we bear in mind it's about multiple sources of evidence. Again, just like trying to get a better dinner, we might rely on all kinds of evidence because in the end it's going to help us make a more informed decision.
Absolutely. And it is really focusing on the core purpose of evidence-based HR, which is that we are therefore more likely to focus on the things that are really important to the business. And that's what it comes back to.
Great.
Okay. So so we've talked a little bit about the sort of the 6-stage framework, and you've kind of given us a little example in terms of how you might approach turnover. Let's talk about some more detailed areas where evidence might have how we could be more evidence-based in some specific areas that will hopefully be of interest to our audience. So I think one of the hottest topics in HR is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, let's just spend a moment thinking about that. How could we be more evidence-driven in tackling that particular topic.
So what's it, if you go back to these same questions that were asked in this case about turnover, you could do exactly the same for EDI issues. So maybe a diversity issue. So what's the problem the organisation thinks it has, opportunity with diversity? And in a sense would ask very similar questions, but around diversity. And if you did that, you'd probably realise that you have a lot of gaps in your evidence, that perhaps you weren't clear enough about what you meant by diversity, perhaps not clear enough about understanding why it might be a problem, what the opportunity is. So actually spending time really digging into that is incredibly important, because what often happens in many areas of practice like diversity is people just jump on certain techniques. For example, like unconscious bias training, they may say, well, everyone's doing unconscious bias training, let's do unconscious bias training. And the best available evidence is that it doesn't in and of itself really make very much difference. So the danger is, without really understanding what the issue is, you're going to just pick on things because you think you'll do something about it. And again, so if you think you did identify some problem or opportunity with diversity, you do the same thing, ask the same kind of question, say, okay, so what can we actually do about that?
Right, okay, absolutely. To think about perhaps a different topic, what about well-being at work?
Yeah, well-being is very interesting. It's a bit like diversity. These are very broad categories, which people often struggle with pinning down what it means. I remember, just as an anecdata, I was at a conference around well-being, and there was a room full of about 200 people from HR and occupational health and others that were responsible for well-being in work, and asked them to tell me what they meant by well-being. And they really struggled. They really struggled to do it. They were all doing lots of stuff, but going back to this slide, for example, saying what's going on, what's the problem, they hadn't really done this. So I think what you would do in the well-being things, you really think what actually are the problems, because well-being is such a broad term, can mean so many different things, from someone feeling a little bit unhappy on a Monday morning to someone having clinical depression. It means lots and lots of different things. Some of those things are probably connected to the workplace, some of them are probably not connected to the workplace. You really need something like this process to start to pinpoint, well, what do we mean by well-being? What is the problem? What is the opportunity exactly? And again, once you think you've identified that, and there are probably multiple issues, that then what can we actually do about it? So very similar kind of thing.
And I guess, looking back to some of the research that we've done, thinking about evidence from inside the organisations, some organisations, perhaps in more of a kind of manual workforce, would do employee screening and getting employees to know their numbers and to measure their kind of cardiovascular health and so on. Those would be quite sort of quantitative internal data from within the organisation that would help sort of diagnose what those issues are. There's a host of scientific evidence in this space, but as you say, tying it back to what are the particular problems that we face as an organisation, whether it's high levels of stress, or whether it's cardiovascular disease being prevalent, or the different issues will differ from one organisation to the other, regardless of the scientific evidence.
Absolutely, the whole issue of context is so important. So even if we think about things that you sort of think might apply generally, like performance, depending on the context, the setting, the employees, the sector, can mean quite different things. And the danger is, without doing a process like this, you're in danger of putting in quite generic stuff, benchmarking, copying what other organisations do, without understanding your context and your setting.
Yeah, and I guess one of the overriding themes of this research is to perhaps use taking an evidence-based lens to take a step back and really question. It's a bit like sort of double learning. We're not just reviewing what we've done, but we're taking one step back to say, are we asking the right questions in the first place? And to question the assumptions that underpin the actions that we're thinking about taking.
And again, I don't know if for the people, looking at these questions now, it looks like a lot of questions, but you can imagine that if you went through this process, the next time you did it, you get much faster at it, you start to learn more. Where is the data? Where have you got gaps? What can you understand and analyse? What do you struggle to understand and analyse? And yes, it's a sort of, I almost think it's a bit of an OD intervention for HR in a way, because it's changing the way in which they go about doing their work in a quite fundamental way.
Okay, great. So I'm going to pause. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and it'd be good to just address those before we move on. So, question from Jennifer. more around definition of EBHR. Is it just a combination of HR plus workforce planning plus people analytics plus talent intelligence? So yeah, what do you think to that?
Yeah, well, it's a combination of things. It's actually a combination of more than those things. It certainly is about a combination of things. And I think the focus there often on people analytics, the analogy I quite like is if you went to see a doctor and your doctor said to you, okay, I'm going to diagnose and I'm going to treat you. I'm only going to look at diagnostic data from you. I'm going to do lots of blood tests, lots of scans. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to use my professional expertise at all, and I'm not going to look at any medical scientific evidence whatsoever. The danger is if you only look at one source of evidence, it turns out to be like that. You would want your doctor, you'd want her to use multiple sources. In the same way, it is about using those sources, but it's about using multiple sources. That's a really important part of it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I guess, EBHR could be used in each of those areas, in workforce planning, in talent, but it can also be applied in other aspects of HR as well. Yeah. And then Scott was just asking the question, which we've kind of been talking about this, but how much is good EBHR based on sorting out the right question to ask first versus using EBHR to sort out what the question to ask actually is. So,
that's a good question about questions. It's a very good question about questions. And I think this is one of the things that actually we'll talk about in a little while, came up in the research a bit. What people often do is they ask questions, but they're kind of the wrong questions. So people might say, oh, what percentage of people are attending our training courses? What percentage of people are finishing our training courses? That kind of information in and of itself is really not very helpful at all for two reasons. One is just because people are going and attending training courses doesn't mean they're learning anything. And secondly, even if they are, it doesn't mean it's actually useful to the business in any way. So we're very good at asking questions, but they're often, to your point, Scott, we're not asking the right kinds of questions. And it starts with what is going on? And what do we mean by what is going on? What do we mean by well-being? What do we mean by diversity? How can we really start to unpack what we think is happening? So that skill of asking relevant and important questions is also core to this, I think.
Yeah. Great questions. So thank you for that. And please keep them coming.
Keep them coming, exactly.
So I'd like to change tack a little bit and reflect on some of the barriers that came up, because I think we can talk about definitions all day long, but it's really about the practical application and overcoming the resistance and the barriers to evidence-based HR that would be very important. So can you sort of take us through what sort of barriers you typically see?
So one of the things that people often say about evidence-based practice in general is it's not that it's difficult, it's not conceptually difficult. So think about getting a better dinner. All of you immediately got that using evidence in that particular way you described an example would help you make a more informed decision about dinner. So people get it. So it's not, if you like, conceptually difficult, but it is hard to do. And as you say, it's because of these kinds of barriers. So now we've got another poll, which is, so everyone has now seen, I guess you've seen a definition, you've seen an example, you've seen the principles. We've talked about how you might do this in areas like wellbeing and diversity. So now you've seen this, I've got a set of questions here about, it's actually this, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong poll. No, I'm on the wrong poll, Yeah, I apologise. So this is poll 2, right? Thank you. Okay, so before we go on to barriers, I want to reflect on the definition and example we've given, and to think about, firstly, this question. We carefully examine at least 3 different sources of information, stakeholder, internal data, professional expertise. So we want to ask whether you never or rarely do that, whether you sometimes do that, or whether you almost always do that. The second question is, we evaluate the trustworthiness of the evidence we have collected and only pay attention to the most reliable evidence. So as we discussed, the idea that you think about how trustworthy it is really crucial. So that's the second question, do you do that? The third one is, we take an explicit and structured approach to our decision making, such that we always start with a careful diagnosis of the problem and its business relevance before we make decisions about possible solutions, and we ask and answer questions in a structured way. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the responses. Let's go back to, give you a few more moments to respond. Okay, so I can see here about a third of you say you almost always look at least 3 different sources. So it's clear that some of you, at least in terms of using multiple sources, are already being quite evidence-based in some senses. The second question here is thinking about trustworthiness evidence, and about 40% of respondents so far said they almost always do that. I'd be interested, perhaps you can put it in the chat. How do you evaluate the trustworthiness of evidence? So if anybody wants to put that in the chat, how do you evaluate the trustworthiness? 40% of you said you do. The source, okay, yeah. Okay, so that's got any advice around about how to improve our judgment? Okay, someone said it's when do you just crack on, as someone put it, and how do you decide the most reliable? Okay. Very interesting. Okay, compare it with other sources. Have an upfront model. If sources have been reliable in the past, consistent with okay, that's interesting. There's certainly all ways potentially of doing it. But just to pick up on an example, the fact that sources are inconsistent doesn't necessarily in and of itself tell you how reliable that data is. So, but it might be telling you, but it also might just mean different sources of evidence telling you different things. The reliability is a source, yes, exactly, that's one way of doing it, thinking about the motivation or incentive behind the source and how much data is available. And why is someone telling you this? Why is someone having that point of view? Yeah, exactly.
And it's interesting looking at the almost always answers.
Yeah.
The lowest of the 3 questions is around taking an explicit and structured approach to decision making.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And I mean, is that sort of typical?
It is typical. And what is it? So one of the things about decision making, when we've done training in the past with managers and HR people, is that most people, even fairly senior decision makers, have never been trained in how to make decisions. So I think we have a sort of curious attitude towards decision making, that it's something we can't learn, it's something we shouldn't do in a structured way. So again, going back to getting a better dinner example, you can see that if you take a structured approach to that, and you maybe start writing down the data you've got about different restaurants and pulling it together in a structure, you're more likely to use that information better. So there is a sense in which we understand having a structure is good, but in practice we don't tend to do. So it's one of those things, back to the point, the concept it's easy to think about, it's easy to understand, but it's hard to do. Yeah, that's what we're going to go on to.
And that sort of takes us neatly into the next area we wanted to talk about, which is why aren't we being more evidence-based? Yeah. And Ben's put this question as well. So what are some of the main areas where you see organisations falling down on evidence-based HR? So let's talk about what gets in the way.
Yeah. So I have another poll here, which is to get you to think about, again, now I have seen an example and we discussed what it entails. What do you think actually are the main things that you would see are making it difficult to sort of adopt this kind of model? So the first question is, it's time consuming and we need to make decisions fast. Is that a barrier? Not much of a barrier, sometimes a barrier, definitely a barrier. So question 1 is that it's time consuming and we need to make decisions fast. Yeah. Question 2 is, another barrier is we don't have easy access to all the sources of evidence. So to what extent is that a barrier for you, getting sources of different types of evidence? The third potential barrier is HR is too easily attracted to short-term fads and fashions. Fourth is we tend to implement solutions without fully understanding the problem. Fifth barrier is the capabilities and skills of the team. And we'll be talking about some of these when we come to our own results in a minute. And also the constant pressure to act and to do stuff. Just give you a few more minutes. Okay, let's see, review some of the answers. So, time consuming, sometimes definitely. So another way of framing this is that only 11% of you thought it isn't much of a barrier. So it's something that, yeah, can be seen as a barrier. And I think one way of thinking of, I think the time consuming aspect of it is, you know, one way of thinking about this is, do you want to make a good decision or a quick decision? Now, they're not necessarily completely opposite, but clearly if you want to make a better informed decision, typically it does take more time. So it's often a choice. Sometimes it's not much of a choice, but doing things fast is not always, but typically it's going to mean it's less informed.
Interestingly, the one that comes out highest in terms of score for definitely a barrier is the constant pressure to act and to do stuff.
Yes. Yeah, we're talking about that one in a second in particular, but yes, it is, isn't it? It's quite high. So again, easy access to different sources of evidence, and typically often people talk about the difficulties, for example, getting scientific evidence, even getting access to the organisational data. It's there, it's around, it's in big databases, but it's quite hard to use. Daniel Kahn, yes, okay, good example. So this idea of thinking fast and slow, and the idea that we have a lot of cognitive biases, is also in itself a kind of barrier to being evidence-based. For example, we may have confirmation bias. We tend to look for evidence and data that supports the view we already kind of have. So not access to different sources of evidence, short-term fads and fashions, not much of a barrier. That's probably one of the lower ones. Implement solutions without putting out the problem. Yeah, sometimes 58%, definitely 36%. Capabilities and skills, yes, again, similar kind of pattern there. So people see it can be a barrier. And this links again, the point you made, Gillian, that 59%, 6% say it's definitely a barrier, had the constant pressure to act and to do stuff. So I've got a particular example way of thinking about that, that pressure to do stuff. These are some other barriers, some of which you mentioned. There's things like organisational politics and power, fads and fashions are mentioned, cognitive biases were mentioned, also career incentives. And some of those pressures to do stuff is for all kinds of reasons, but sometimes it is career incentives. Often we are paid for and rewarded for getting stuff done, completing things, not for whether those things are actually valuable or useful in any way. Perceived need for speed, people believing there already are evidence-based access and so on. But I think the pressure to act is really a very strong one, as people on this course seem to think as well. And here's some examples of, well, a way of thinking about it is this. Now, you might be surprised to see this slide appearing here with shoe bombs and screening and TSA, but you may remember a lot of this stuff came in after 9/11, where the TSA and other security bodies around the world really started very heavily getting into all kinds of activities, technique, programs to try and make make flying in the air more safer in different ways. But pretty quickly, what people started saying is that this stuff really was theatre. It was done to look as though you were doing things and you were trying to make things better, to maybe to convince and reassure people that you're looking after the security, when actually you probably weren't, or some of it was, but a lot of it wasn't. More recently, this is the definition of security measures that make people feel more secure without doing anything to actually improve their security. You often get a large number of initiatives. Some might be effective, some might be ineffective, and some actually may do more harm than good. So this is a sense when theatre's going on, this is what tends to happen. And this is a more recent example from the COVID-19 pandemic, where people describe some of the things that people were doing as hygiene theatre, like wiping down surfaces, because the virus wasn't particularly transmitted through surfaces. So it probably wasn't a very useful thing to do, but a similar kind of process. Now, if you think about management and HR, you can actually look at the way in which the stuff we do also can be sometimes feel like theatre. And what's the problem with doing this theatre? Well, firstly, it actually isn't likely to help anyone. Things like unconscious bias training I mentioned, might be mental health first aid, things like annual performance appraisals. These are all classic activities that are sort of meant to help, but probably don't particularly. People often say, well, this stuff can't do any harm, but I think even doing stuff that doesn't help can cause harm, because it wastes resources and people's time. It gives the impression something's being done when it's not. So now it says people feel you're dealing with the issue, but you're probably not. And also it distracts people from the real causes of problems and solutions. So we tend to do things that we think are going to help, but actually we're not really dealing with the problems. And also it causes cynicism. So I guess employees get quite fed up with HR saying, here's another thing and another thing and another thing. Partly they do because they can't understand how it's being helpful, how it's going to help anyone. And also gets in the way, I think, in development of HR as a function, because a lot of the focus becomes on impression management. Now, I'm not going to ask you, unless you really want to answer that question now, but my guess is if you think about what you've been doing the last couple of weeks at work, my guess would be a chunk of that, and it will vary a lot. It's probably, if you really think about it, it's a bit like theatre. So it maybe it's not clear it's making much difference, but that pressure to act, to be seen to be doing something, yeah, is pretty strong.
Okay, and that also came out in some of the themes around the what's happening in evidence-based HR. I guess we'll talk about this more in a minute, but the EBHR itself is a political process. So, we're never going to get away completely from being absolutely kind of Spock-like and objective and logical and rational. There's always the demands of key stakeholders and what appetite there is in the organisation for implementing whatever recommendations come out of that evidence-based process. So we do have to take account of that.
And politics is absolutely part of it. Yes, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So what were the kind of key findings of the research so far?
So for this report, we did a survey, we did interviews with various HR professionals, and we asked them questions about what they thought evidence-based HR was, if they were doing it, what are the barriers, what they thought it meant, if it was useful. And a number of themes, when we analysed the data, a number of themes came out of this. I'm not going to talk about all of them, just most of them, but these are some of the main ones, such as HR as a function as more access to data, for example, theme 1. Theme 7, I mentioned that already, evidence-based HR is not complicated, but it is difficult. So these are some of the things that came out. I'm going to go into some of them in more detail and using some illustrative quotes. So there's this whole issue, and I'm going to be interested if people want to type in the chat about this because it came out a lot. It's the idea that HR as a function now has access to more data than ever and is sort of using it more, but it's not necessarily leading to greater insight and to making better informed decisions. So we have more data, particularly internal data, but is it actually leading to more insights? And Siobhan Sheridan here from the Financial Conduct Authority, she says, I'm not sure that what most organisations need is more people analytics. I think what they need is more people insights. And I think that insight is a human game. It requires taking analytics, experience and expertise, all of the other evidence base that HR practitioners can bring, and having a really strong collaborative conversation with the business to surface the things that would be genuinely insightful for that organisation. So it's this idea, yes, compared to say 10 years ago, compared to the first report we did in 2011, there's no argument, there's a lot more data around, particularly internal data. Is there greater insight? Maybe not always, and not as much as it could be.
And Scott's making a really good point that data and insight are not the same things, but that's not necessarily well understood.
That's right, and I think as Siobhan's quote says, the insight. I think I really like this quote because she says it's a human game. Insight is a human game. That idea that you have to think about other sources of evidence, use your own expertise, use your understanding of the context. It's not just about a bunch of numbers. So that's insight.
Yeah. And then Ben sort of recognising the challenge in particular for HR getting from data to insight, not necessarily a skill set that we have in spades as a function. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely right. And I think one simple way of thinking about how can people analytics, how can you get better insight from it? I mean, put it simply, is to focus on the important business problems and to incorporate other sources of data. So a bit like I said about the medical example, a doctor could just use, your own internal data and things, diagnostic test, but it's a very impoverished source of information on its own. And the same is true, I think, of people analytics. To get that insight, you need to talk to people, you need to think about science, you need to think about your expertise, you need to think about the context. So,
It's really back to that core question of what are the important and relevant things and what do we know about what's going on. And then Jennifer really sort of pointing out it's not just about having the data, but it's also about the interpretation and the presentation of it. And there is something about putting together a story about selling and persuasion.
Yeah. And I think that also speaks to Jennifer's points. It also speaks to the idea of being explicit. So you actually share that evidence, you share that data, you share that information. You're not just, you actually make it accessible to everyone in order to get, I guess, the most insight you can.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess it very much goes to, there are lots of companies have set up data analytics functions, for example, but the expertise can't just sit there.
No,
that has to be elevated and shared and understood widely across the business decision makers in order to have impact.
Yeah. And there's a big thing as well about, which is a part of this theme, I suppose, is that people were getting analysis, getting data, but they couldn't necessarily use it. So it's this idea, it's not helping, it's not giving insight.
But there's also, as Donna pointing out, the flip side, the danger of that, in that you can also use data to mould to a particular narrative.
Yes.
So again, bringing in the kind of politics of the situation.
Yeah, and this is also one of the interesting, so as you mentioned, often people talk about telling a story with data, and that's okay if the story is accurately serving the data you've got. And often what you find is, particularly politically, people will say, I just want this to happen. I'll tell a great story and I'll pick the bits of data that help me with that story, which obviously is kind of the wrong way around to do it. And that is a danger.
We see that all the time in news presentations of genetics. So all the findings around certain conditions being genetically linked, and when you scrape underneath.
There's not much.
That's right. Okay.
The second theme is that multiple sources of evidence are used to some extent, but not all are used as much as they could be. So, for example, more use of scientific evidence, we mentioned already, more use of qualitative data as well. And Jackie Westerman from the BBC said, I think there's a kind of misconception across the profession that being more evidence-based just means using a few more numbers. And my guess is, for most people listening to this might be one of the biggest surprises, that actually when we talk about evidence, it doesn't just mean numbers and scientific evidence, which you mentioned already. And this idea of using multiple sources is so core to the principles of evidence-based practice. It's really, really important.
Yeah, and in the reports we talk about 4 key sources of evidence. One of which is scientific evidence, but there are other factors that are equally as important.
The third theme is understanding and use of evidence-based HR as an approach to define process is limited. So people are doing things, and again, you may reflect on your own practice, and we're kind of doing it to some extent, we're doing parts of it. But as Tim Haynes from Jazz Pharmaceuticals says, I do think HR has been evidence-based for a long time, but maybe not in as comprehensive a way as the 4-step model, the 4-source model would suggest. So in other words, the understanding appears to be quite limited, and the doing of it is, although clearly some people are doing some parts of it, no doubt about that. Theme 5 here is evidence and data should be used to help HR support the business in achieving its goals, not to justify HR's existence. And Quintin Heath here from EBHR, nice quote, when we talk about evidence, that can either be compliance data or some evidence that it's having an effect in the business. A business may have a 95% completion rate for performance reviews. That might be evidence that you've got compliance, which is good, but it's not enough. We could also ask if the actions in the performance reviews have been completed. Now you've got a metric that tells you that actions are completed, and a metric that there's been high compliance with the request to conduct performance reviews. But none of that tells you whether the performance review process has moved the business. So again, if you think about some of the data you may collect, is it really helping the business, or is it helping to explain to the business, look at all the stuff we're doing? And this was a theme that came out as well, I think. Theme 6, thinking about the quality of data and evidence is recognised as something that is important, but could be done much better. I was interested in the poll we did before, that quite a lot of you, more than I was expecting, said you did try and think about the quality of data and evidence. And this is not something people, I think, are routinely trained to do. They may do it, they may think about it, and have a chat about it, but again, typically people aren't really trained to think about the quality of data and to pay attention to the best quality data. And Melvin Fraser from First Abu Dhabi Bank says, I think we're challenged by the different types of evidence, whether it's data or the collation of opinions and ideas, and sifting through what's valid and invalid. This is the complicated but difficult. EBHR is not complicated, but difficult. There's many barriers, and we've discussed quite a few of them already. Ian McKendrick from Volvo says we may be getting used to using evidence, but are we yet sufficiently confident and competent? Of course not. We can definitely improve. One way we might do that is how we judge the value of different sources of evidence and how we can bring the different sources of evidence together, which is a key part, bringing them sort of together. Theme 8, this is external benchmarking issue. And again, when we're talking to people about the sources of evidence they use, there was a view that benchmarking, looking at what works for others, is something you should really treat very cautiously. Guy Eccles here from B&Q says, I find external validations or benchmarking of what other companies do to be the least compelling bit of evidence in how I'm judging what's right or wrong or where we should go with this. Consultants will tell you superficially that 27% of companies do this, that or the other, but when you dig below the surface as to what's really going on, they don't know. So that's another source of evidence, maybe not so useful. So should we see if there's anything in the chat?
Yeah, I think there's a really good question from Chris. So we've had a bit of a negativity bias going on here, which suggests we've got some humans in the room, right?
Yeah.
Where has it worked well is the question.
Yeah.
Are there good examples of where EBHR has worked well?
There are. One of the challenges with, I guess, sharing those examples is they're quite contextual. I can tell you some from my own experience, some of the principal where it's worked well. I think it's worked well when, I guess, an HR team or a function is sort of committed to trying to do it. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. You have to have an HR team that says, yes, we want to do what's best for the business. We want to be explicit about understanding to find the problem and explicit about using evidence data to understand the solution. And equally important, saying maybe the things we did in the past haven't worked. So I think it works well if people approach it, if you like, a fairly open and honest way, saying we're not going to, as an HR function, tell you that everything that we do is great. The stuff we're doing now might not be good. The stuff we're doing in the future might not be good, but we're following a process which is trying to increase the likelihood that we are doing stuff that's going to help the business in some way. Mm-hmm. So where I've seen it work well is when there's actually a real commitment of the team, particularly obviously the head of that team, that group, to actually trying to do it and not being, I guess, not being scared of scrutiny. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the things historically, I think, for HR, that obviously historically has always had the idea that, seat at the table and all those kinds of arguments. Part of the response to that is actually to be quite defensive and possibly to overhype how brilliant and how wonderful HR is. And like any area of practice, of course, sometimes what you do will be work and be really effective. Sometimes what you do will not be. So I think it's that openness and honesty about the data. I think that's actually worked well.
And I guess it's also a mindset thing. So rather than considering evidence-based HR to be a thing, it is a theory in its own right. It's really about bringing a bit more rigor, a bit more structure to how we approach any aspect of what we do in HR.
And part of that mindset thing is also, I think, another back to the question of where it's worked well, is that you don't do this for everything. Mm-hmm. There's some things you just, for political and other reasons, compliance reasons, you just need to do, and actually you can just get on with those things. But for things where you really think there's an important problem opportunity for the business, which HR can help with, and it's a medium to long-term thing, I think saying, okay, this is where we need to take this mindset because this is really important for the business. Mm-hmm. So I think choosing when you do it is also quite important.
And maybe there's, in addition to your kind of 6 questions in the framework, maybe there's a question that says, do we need to take that evidence-based approach to dealing with the situation?
Is this something that requires an evidence-based approach or not? I think the main thing that would drive it is, do you have any choice? Someone just told you to do it and you just have to do it. And again, it's issue, is it important? I think if it's really important, if it's not so important, then why would you do this? You don't need to.
And I think one of the other points that Wendy Hirsch raised in the report, so Wendy's one of the co-authors of your initial report and also the more recent report, is around implementation as well.
Yes.
So it's not just about bringing an evidence lens to what you do, but also thinking about how you do it and implementing in a way that's more likely to lead to success.
Yes, and I think sometimes there's a sense in which there's a danger in which people can get very kind of bureaucratic about this, and they see the model and they see the approach, and they just get into, if you like, the process, and just get into ticking all the boxes. Of course, it's important to follow the process, but it's also important to bear in mind it's about making a more informed decision. So if you need to cut corners into some bits you don't quite do so well, that's okay, as long as you acknowledge maybe there's bits you missed out, because you're still likely to make a better informed decision.
And it's about a better dinner, not the most perfect dinner you've ever eaten in your life.
Exactly. And the term itself, evidence-based HR, and the model can sound like I'm going to make the optimal decision, and you're not. When you're choosing that restaurant in wherever it is, Amsterdam or Madrid or Stockholm, I'm not trying to prove which is the best restaurant in Stockholm or get the best dinner. I'm just trying to get a better dinner. And in HR, that's what we want to make better informed decisions to help the business, not to find some ultimate solution. Because the kind of things we're dealing with, there isn't one anyway. There isn't an ultimate solution. There's lots of options, lots of choices, which all will have kind of trade-offs. So I think it's about always bearing in mind it's about a more informed decision.
Yeah, okay. So we've got just a few minutes left with Rob. So last chance really to pop in any questions that you have, or any points or comments you'd like to make. And thank you so much for all the interactions so far. It's it makes it so much more of a lively conversation. So okay, so Donna really just endorsing what you're saying. We're essentially looking to make a decision based on all the reliable evidence available to you.
Exactly. Best available, and again, this Donna's point about what's available to you. So again, going back to the idea this is a developmental thing, you may try this and you may again realise that there's lots of important sources of information that are not available to you. They're so hard to get. Well, that's fine. That means next time you can put things in place to make sure you do have access to that stuff. Yeah.
And just going back to Chris's challenge around sharing examples of where evidence-based HR has worked well, I think it's important to note, as we said at the outset, this is a two-stage process to this research. Yes. So the phase that we're going into now is looking at what are the models and frameworks that can help us, but also to look for examples. So we're very keen to pull together case studies and good examples that we can share that will hopefully give inspiration to people. So maybe tell us a little bit about next steps.
If please put in more questions if you've got them. I think Ben's got another one here about satisfying the criteria. I think there are some that there's always gaps. There's always things people could have done a little bit better, and that's fine. But yes, you can do that, and I think it's again go back to this point about being kind of explicit that that's what you want to do and that's what you're trying to do, and being open about bits maybe you haven't done and how you could do it better next time. So I think you do get that, but you don't want the big bureaucracy around it, or just to speed things up for the sake of it. You're implying that, Ben. So just to summarise some of the things that come out this first report, that firstly, all practitioners in every field always use evidence, and evidence-based practice evolved to help us make more informed decisions in lots of fields. 2, it's 3 basic principles on multiple sources, structured approach, and focusing on the most trustworthy evidence. It's about getting a good dinner. Some of the earliest discussions of EBHR go back to 2000, and CRF's, our first report was 2011, and there's been quite a lot of other things since then. EBHR typically uses evidence from different sources. As you mentioned, the 4 sources: stakeholders, organisational data, and it follows a structured approach to doing that. And the interviews with participants showed a clear understanding of the need to make better use of evidence. So for me, doing the interviews, one of the most striking things is I didn't speak to anyone who felt that the way in which they or their function and HR made decisions was quite good. I think everybody said, no, we can definitely do this better. And I think people analytics has given people a flavour. Yeah, well, actually, we really can do this much better. But there's a sense in which this is whatever the start, pardon the cliche, it's sort of start of a journey. It's not people aren't halfway there yet, but there's a really strong awareness you could do that. So the next stage 1 is about taking stock of where we are now. What's happened since 2011. Stage 2 will be the practicals about working with CRF members and others to develop practical guidance, frameworks and technique to help HR functions develop their EBHR capacity. So the stage 1 is where are we now? Stage 2 is how can we actually help speed this up and develop this? So what are the gaps in our capacity and capability? We discussed some already today, but What else do we need to be able to do? How can we incorporate more of these principles into our everyday HR decision making? So how can we start to slowly make it an automatic kind of natural thing? And how can we make better use of the evidence we have? And how can we gather the new evidence we might need? So there's some of the questions we'll be addressing in stage 2. All of it is about developing, say, practical tools to help HR functions actually get better doing evidence-based HR. And if you'd like to participate in the research, please contact us and let us know. We're going to be running some pilots, probably we're going to do more interviews, we're going to be looking for examples of good practice. So please do get in touch. Yeah,
we'd love to hear from you. So just to say thank you very much to Rob for taking us through the research today, and also to all of you for participating and making this a really
thank you very much
interactive session. And we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.